Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to allow a couple of minutes for more people to join us before we get started. So we'll see if many more join us. But thank you all for coming today. Wonderful, okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to give it a couple of more, about 30 more seconds before we get started. Let it get to 32 minutes past. Let's see if anyone else joins us. But thank you for joining us in today's webinar. We'll get started in a minute. Okay. Right, let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar today. My name's Kate Gore. I'm the Digital Transformation Officer here at the NCF, and it's really wonderful that you all could join us today for what is the Walking the Yellow Brick Road of digital adoption for your organisation. Just a bit of history and context as to how we got kick-started on the session today. In part of wanting to develop more knowledge and share information within the sector between care organisations and providers, the NCF have adopted a new kind of community of practice, is what we're calling it. This is part of the digital subgroup for that, with the aim of being able to allow care providers to share knowledge between them, have some takeaways from lessons learned, challenges faced, and really with the intention to be able to provide more knowledge within the sector between small, medium or large care providers. And we're very fortunate at NCF that we have a membership base that allows us to be part of this community of practice and share this knowledge. Just as a few kind of like little stop-offs, so I will be plugging as part of the NCF, we have our Digital Transformation Forum taking part on the 14th of February, so nice Valentine's Day session there for everybody. That will be from 10:30 till 12, so if you'd like to join us for the Digital Transformation Forum, that will be on the NCF website for sign-ups. Please also applaud for everyone to come and join us on that session. Leading into today's session, so the timescale for today's session will be me giving this brief introduction, followed by two member organisations of NCF who have both digitally adopted ways of working within their organisations very differently, but have some interesting and valid points that they've taken from their digital journeys. We have MenCap and Ambient who will be speaking in today's session. Absolutely honoured that they could join us. I think they're absolutely brilliant organisations in supporting care and really how digital can aid in that support for individuals out there in the care sector. We've got Mark Poutney and Trish Williams from MenCap, and we also have Lee Hodgson from Ambient. So there'll be a 20 to 25 minute presentation given from each. Questions and answers at the end of this session as well for anyone who wants to know any more. The ultimate aim of this session is to find positive ways of working through digital adoption. You know, how do you know where to start when you don't know what the original question is? What's the original remit for it? How do you even begin on a journey that for a lot of people is very daunting and complex? So hopefully this session can simplify it and allow for greater knowledge to be passed on. So I'm very honoured that you all could join us for it, because this is the first session of what we hope to be many more in areas that we find interesting here as part of the digital transformation team at NCF. If you would like to, please write your name, organisation and title into the chat box. It'd be great to know who's joining us today. And also, if there's any questions, please put them into the chat as well, and we will address them at the end of the session. But for now, I will pass us on to Mark and Trish from MenCap, who will be giving the first presentation. So let me bring up the slides and enjoy.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. I'll just give you a minute to get the slides up.
Yeah.
And then you can do I'll do my best Chris Whitty and do the next one, please, as well. So thanks for that. So I think, well, it's always interesting to reflect, and it's been good to have a chance to reflect on the journey that we had over the last couple of years, since 2018, in fact. But to focus us for today, we're aiming to give you a high-level view of the digital journey that we went on with our colleagues in what we call personal support, and then to share some key lessons. So I'm splitting the presentation with Mark, so you'll hear from me first, and I'm going to focus on the programme that we delivered, and then Mark is going to pick up from the lessons we learnt from that. So I'm going to aim to use clear language and avoid jargon, but please pick me up in the chat on anything that isn't clear, and I will come back and cover that. And then there is some small font here, and I can see there was a question in the chat about sharing slides. So we can definitely share our slides after this, because as I say, there is some font that's quite small on some of the images, but I'll aim to cover that. So my role on the digital transformation, certainly as it started out, was as change lead for the programme that we're going to talk about. I think that's it for the first slide, Kate. So I'll do my next slide, please. That's lovely. Thank you. This is just a visual, really, of the journey that we have been on since 2018. So we started out with, as often these things do, with a business case, and what we tried to do really was to really focus on our users. So a lot of work was done with the business case, and then with the development of the system that then followed, which is called the What Matters Most app. And the system itself, I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute and give you a visual for. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of size and scale for MenCap before we dive into the details. So we're a charity, obviously, for people with learning disabilities and a provider of social care. So we employ around 7,000 staff in what we would term the social care part of our organisation, and we call that personal support. So when I talk about our digital journey in personal support, I'm talking about with those 7,000 staff who are predominantly support workers and service managers. So in personal support, we've got a range of different services that we deliver, and that includes registered care, supported living and community-based services. So quite a range of different services as well to cover. And in the main pack, when it gets circulated, there is a link if you wanted to know more about the organisation itself, to kind of put in context what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of the journey that we went on, as I say, it started in 2018 with the business case. The business case was to build an in-house application that we called the What Matters Most application. And the reason we use that name is because it was linked to what we term our What Matters Most quality framework. So it's there to support that quality framework and to try and ensure that we follow that in our services. So the app was only part of what we did. So I'm going to talk more about the app in a minute, but we also had to deliver what we term the MenCap digital identity, which gave our colleagues access to things like Outlook, email, some things that we do in terms of HR self-service online. We call that MyView, and you'll see that on one of the flags on the left. Yammer, which we use as our sort of internal social media type platform, which is quite actively used now. But back in 2018, people didn't have access. So colleagues didn't really have access to any of these things. And we really started at quite a, I don't want to say a low base, but it was organizationally, we were quite immature, really, from a digital point of view in our social care side of our organization. So this really was a huge change for our colleagues. They would, I think, have described themselves, and still describe themselves, and rightly so, as focused on providing care to the people that we support, and really trying to enable people to live happy and healthy lives. So digital isn't necessarily top of the list, as I'm sure that will resonate with you all. And using digital tools was quite a significant change for colleagues. So we started in 2018 with the business case, and then design, some testing in a small number of our services. Obviously got feedback from that testing and refined the app as the solution. And we didn't really get going with the full rollout until 2020. So obviously then COVID hit. It's good timing. So some of the model that had been planned for delivery had to shift, because the original support was designed to be face-to-face originally, and we obviously had to shift that in pretty quick time so that it was delivered remotely and self-service. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about how that changed things. So we started rolling out in July of 2020, and we had about, let me think about it now, there were about 360 services that we started to deliver to at that point in time. And when we finished delivery in November, December of 2021, we'd rolled out to all 7,000 colleagues in personal support. So it was quite a big program of delivery. And after that point, we started to do the embedding, because obviously the tool had been introduced, the means had been handed over to our colleagues, but that wasn't necessarily the end of the journey by any means. So it was a good starting point. Okay, I'll do the next slide, please. So there's a little bit in this which is about I've termed it "Be Like Alice." So I don't know whether you're familiar with the Alice in Wonderland quote around the Cheshire Cat saying, you know, "Where are you going?" to Alice. And Alice says, "Which way should I go?" And the cat says, "Depends where you're going." And Alice says she doesn't know. So the cat then says, "It doesn't matter which way you go, does it?" So we try to avoid that, really. We try to say, where are we heading to, and where are we starting from? So we designed I suppose you'd call it a sort of capability assessment that was done around a sort of fairly simple 9-box model. And we started by establishing a baseline with a standard questionnaire that said, where do our services and our colleagues in services feel they currently are? And the majority of services back in 2020 reported that they were in box 1 or 2. So what that meant was that, you know, colleagues felt they didn't have the tools at that point, because some of them hadn't received their kit, and connections were still being sorted out for some services. So not surprising that people hadn't really made much of a start. Some services had connections, but there might only have been a service manager laptop, for example. So might have had some exposure to digital tools, but not a great deal. So we tried to make sure we kept tabs on this then through the deployment. And after each delivery phase, we did a test to see where colleagues felt they were as they finished their sort of experience, if you like. So we went through in phases of 12 to 16 weeks with groups of services at a time, and tested them, as I say, in terms of what were their feelings in terms of where they were starting out from. And then once they'd finished their kind of physical 16-week deployment, where we moved away from them and left them alone and in peace with the tools to start having a go for themselves, we measured again to say, where do colleagues feel they actually were? We then did an overall measurement in May of this year that said, okay, so 6 months after we'd finished deployment to all 7,000 colleagues, where do people feel they were? So we'd done a fairly robust measurement of the start and the end point. So as I say, majority of services started in boxes 1, 2. So either hadn't started or were needing to play catch up. And when we finished, services were broadly in boxes 5 to 6. So trying things out or felt they'd been quite successful, but were building their skills. So it was a really clearly marked shift that colleagues went on. But that still didn't necessarily mean that we were far down the road as we wanted to be in terms of changing ways of working, because this was still something that was quite new for people. I'll do my next slide, please, Kate. Oh, is it moving? I'll pause a second. Playing up. There we go. So just to try and give you a sense of what the system actually looks like. So when colleagues log on to the app, this is what they see. It's very much focused around moving what were previously daily records that people would capture on paper and moving that online. So as I mentioned, it's been developed internally, working with our support worker colleagues. And it's been built, and I'm going to get a bit technical now, on what is called a low-code platform. So for anybody that isn't familiar with low-code, and I wasn't when I started the change lead role, it allows developers to drag and drop different components in an application and connect them together to create mobile or web apps. I'll let Mark correct me if I haven't quite got that right, but that's how it was described to me. So we chose a low-code platform, a fairly simple design, and focused it around a one-page profile that was then really all about the person that we were supporting. So it's designed very much from the individual for recording things that are important to them, as you can see, things that that are the people we're supporting, are really great at, things that they might find difficult, and then thinking about the outcomes that people want to achieve. So it's very personally focused. It also captures, as you'll see, well, you might be able to see small text on the right, but support plans, risk assessments, all around the individual again. So big emphasis on the individual, and a lot more monitoring has been added, which I'll share with you as well, because there's quite a list of things that are now in the app because it's been built and added to over time. Yeah, Kate, I'll do another next slide, please. So we now capture quite a lot of information in the app. We've most recently looked at the access for our agency staff that we work with, so agency workers. It's obviously not employed by MenCap. It's been an external access, and that's had its challenges. I won't dwell on that now, but it was difficult. It's been something that's difficult, and we're testing now live. We've rolled out medication to some services, but that's a slow burn because we've got to take that really carefully, because we have still got some services who have connectivity issues, and therefore it's more sensible for them to keep their current process rather than move over to medicines in the app until their connection is sorted out and stable. And we're shortly going to be rolling out incident reporting, which is actually a separate app, but our colleagues in personal support will access it through the What Matters Most app. So sort of slightly complicated way of doing that from a technical point of view, but it'll be much easier for our colleagues to just have one app to be able to access things. So that's going to be rolled out in Q2 this year. So yeah, quite a lot of things included now, which is great. I'll do my next slide, please, Kate, if that's okay. Okay. So I mentioned that we used a sort of a rollout plan that was I said 12 to 16 weeks. There was some flexibility given to colleagues in services as we rolled this out, because we were going through the COVID pandemic. We had obviously some COVID outbreaks in some of our services, and we needed to allow some flexibility for colleagues in those services to say, we need to pause while we deal with an outbreak, and then we'll come back to our deployment. So it was quite a tricky thing to plan and organise and sort of pause and pick up and make sure that everybody got the support they needed in a logical order. So we had a standard rollout plan because it was helpful for us to have some standardisation and for people to experience consistently their sort of progress through receiving this app. So their colleagues had a phase where we sort of got them ready and made sure people had access to the things they needed. Learning and development resources were delivered. Some of that was online digital learning. Some of it was face-to-face. It was over Teams. And you can start to imagine some of the challenges of in a non-digital workforce trying to deliver a deployment that's remote and requires people to access things like Teams. It was quite a challenge, but with support, we got there. We had some training with managers. We gave colleagues time to practice with the tools. And then we went into the sort of stage 3, where we started to, as a program team, step away a little and allow people to practice with the tools themselves. And then by the time they went through the end of stage 3, they went into what we term go live, and they were live with the tools in their services, and the program team did a handover and stepped away. So all services went through this sort of similar pattern. The other thing that we had that was interesting was a sort of multidiscipline team, and I guess this is a bit of a luxury of being a large organisation, because we have got teams that support, of which Mark and I are part, what we call our enabling teams. And we had what we termed a universal support model. So that was a multidisciplinary team of people from IT and HR, myself as the change lead, supporting those teams because technical issues, etc., came up for colleagues. You can't deliver a program on this size and scale without having technical problems coming up fairly regularly. And that team were really focused on trying to solve those problems. So that was just something to bear in mind, that we did have that extra support there for colleagues. So as I say, full rollout completed by the end of 2021, and then we stepped right away as a programme team by Q1 2022. So still fairly recent in our memories and minds. Kate, I'll do a next slide, please. And I'm going to hand over to Mark. Now, Kate, just something that I'm wary of. There were a couple of slides in the original pack that were hidden, and I sent an updated slide pack that you might not have had. So I'm just wondering, Mark, 2 of those were the ones that you were going to cover, whether you might have an issue when you come to slides 9 and 10 not actually being visible. So yeah, just spotted that because one of my slides didn't pop up, but I talked about it, so we haven't missed anything. Okay, but I'll hand over to Mark.
Cool. Welcome everyone. So I'm Chief Information Officer at MenCap, and started just as the program was finishing. So some of my experiences, I haven't got the scars that Trish does from running the program, but some observations looking at it from the side of it being handed over as a business as usual service that we were supporting from the centre. So some things we learned at a program level. Clearly COVID made it more important but harder, and Trish has spoken to that, so I won't dwell on that. But you know, doing a digital adoption at a time when you had to do it all digitally, you know, maybe that was a good thing, maybe it wasn't. It added some additional challenges, and I think we're still experiencing some of those, and I'll talk to that in a second. I guess something that's particular to an organisation of our scale is the difficulty of involving people individually. So we get feedback now where people say, oh, well, I wasn't involved in the decision to, no one asked me if, I didn't, you know. And what we have to say is, well, actually, when we're doing this, we have to test things with small groups of people, validate they work, and then we have to scale them. So some individuals will always feel sort of to an extent disempowered by the process because they don't feel that they were as involved as they would have liked to have been. But at a large organization scale, that's genuinely quite difficult. I guess if you're a smaller provider with 5 or 6 care homes, you could probably do that on an individual basis and have that face-to-face time with people so that they, you can understand their fears and anxieties and involved in those decisions. We did, as Trish has shown you, the application is very much based on feedback from our support workers. So it's not like we presented a solution that you'll accept this, but that is clearly a representative sample of people who contributed to that. One key thing for all of you to know is the role of the service manager in our experience has been really critical to success. If the service manager isn't feeling comfortable digitally, that tends to permeate amongst their team of support workers. So actually getting the service manager to buy in and to handle some of the challenges that do arise is really, really key. So we've certainly found that to be an important lesson learned. I think one of the things, as we're on the other side of the rollout, is that a lot of concentration went into putting the data into the application. Less was put into getting data out of the application. And I think what that's doing now is leaving us a little bit of a bit of catch-up exercise where managers saying, great, it's all going in, but I can't see it. I've got to go to individual record. I can't see the sort of management information that I need about the people we support now. So it's quicker than paper, but there's a bit that's sort of missing, so we're playing catch up in that. So, when you're starting off the journey, if that's where you are, think as much about getting the data out as getting it in, because that is critical. We, in an attempt to roll out the solution quickly and during COVID, and connections in COVID were difficult because, service providers weren't going to site, and all those kind of things. So we used a lot of MiFi devices. Those are the kind of small kind of mobile units that have a SIM card in that allow you to provide connectivity. That was really good to get us up and running, but what we found is they can be very expensive and they don't always provide the best quality of internet connectivity. And I guess when I look at the NHS and DHSC, what good looks like framework, we're really in the foundations piece. This connectivity is critical. Everything that sits above that, so even devices sit above that. If you don't get the connectivity right, you're really going to struggle, because it just makes everything harder for colleagues to adopt digital if just getting it on and doing something is hard. So I would along with some of the things Trish said at the beginning about identity and connectivity and devices are really critical. They're kind of hygiene factors, but you need to give them the right level of emphasis. And some people may be far down that journey and it doesn't feel like a big stretch. Others, it might be quite a big stretch. But make sure you give those hygiene factors sufficient emphasis in your project and journey. We also made some choices about devices. We ended up adopting Chromebooks. That was predominantly, when I look back on the business case, a cost-driven decision. Just a word of not caution, but think about the total cost of ownership of devices. So what is the right device in your context with your organization, rather than the cheapest device in the short term? Because the cheapest device in the short term doesn't necessarily end up being the cheapest and best device in the longer term, because you need a device that allows people to work effectively rather than struggling against the device. And we're doing some trials now with touchscreen tablets, because they're actually a better form factor for people to use. Just to interact with the app and get things done. One other observation from us, which is a big one, and I know Lee's going to talk to an Ambience experience, which is different, predates both Trish and I, but there was a decision to build an application, as Trish described, on a low-code platform rather than buy. Don't think it wasn't the wrong decision at the time, because the market for digital social care record applications was relatively limited at the time. But if I was doing it now from this point in the organization, I don't think I would recommend people to build unless you have a really compelling reason to do so. In particular with the standardization of what a digital social care record application should do, coming out of all the need to share and exchange data and the assured supplier list, my sense with applications is the grass is always greener. Whichever way you go, you feel that the other choice is the right one. I wish I'd had the flexibility to build the functionality you want. Oh, this supplier is really difficult to work with, or I wish I'd chosen that supplier. Given that, certainly from our perspective, what I would just as an observation is noting the total cost of ownership of building your own solution, because we've now built structurally into the organization a level of cost that we have to support on an ongoing basis. That's in terms of the licensing for the Loco platform, and also the sort of developers. We have 3 people who develop the application, and sort of range of other resources around that. So that's built in quite a lot of cost to the organization on an ongoing basis. And now we're going to have to maintain that in terms of complying with what's required coming out of the NHS. So there's, just if you were in that decision mode, think it through quite carefully and think about the total cost of ownership, not just, it's quicker and easier now and I can get what I want. And the last thing on this is, it is a journey, and that sort of sounds slightly trite, but the bits where you go faster, bits where you go slower, sometimes you go backwards before you go forwards. And I think we're in a bit of that phase at the moment. Post the rollout of the program, we, like many of us in social care, probably experiencing a bit of sort of burnout from staff, as they've gone through the whole of COVID, and we've rolled out this on top, and then we were trying to do some organizational changes on top of that. And we found, people's ability to absorb that level of change quite hard. So be careful what else is going on in your organization at the same time. I guess the pace at which you can travel can be wary of people's ability to absorb the level of change and sensitive to their needs, whilst also you've got to drive it forward. You can't sit back and if people are resistant to change, you can't sit there and go, well, that's all right, I'll just wait until you're okay with it in 3 years' time. But be sensitive to the feedback you're getting from colleagues across the organization. Next slide, please.
I believe that's the last slide on this one. There is.
Okay, I think if you right click on those slides, you should get an unhide option. See where it says hide slide? If you click on that, it should hopefully be visible for people. And the one above it might be the same, the slide 9. If you try again and right click on slide 9, and it should allow you to unhide. Is it? It's done. Yeah, it's done 9. It hasn't done 10. You might have to redo 10. Try that one. Took me ages to find that yesterday. Developing my own digital skills. There we go.
I'm conscious of time, so I'll probably whiz through these next 2 quite quickly, and then spend a couple of minutes on the last one before handing over to Lee. So some things we've learned. These are comments post going live and closing the program down as a formal thing. So starting on the left, we've recently done a survey of users of our app, and we've had upwards of 1,000 replies, which is fantastic. What's interesting as an observation is that people are saying, we hear different bits of noise. Some people say, oh, it's it doesn't work, it's blah, I don't like it, or it's difficult. But actually, what it's showing us is that most people who responded saying it's easier and better, but not necessarily faster, which is really interesting. So it's an interesting observation that people say, it gives me better information. It's a single place to get it, but it isn't always quicker. So we need to think, is that just a thing, and that's just a reality, or is it something we need to address as we go forward? But definitely comments that it's easier and better, which is fantastic. Second one, we've observed, particularly with the workforce crisis in social care, that where we've got social service managers, and they're recruiting, their focus clearly is on candidates who deliver great care to the people we support, and they're not looking for candidates with good digital skills. And I guess that's a sector-wide issue, that there's relatively low levels of digital maturity and skills within the sector. And that does hold us back, because we think we've solved the problem, we've rolled it all out, and then lo and behold, you've got 30% churn rate. You've got a whole new slew of people who you need to train and get up to speed. So that process that Trish described is sort of an ongoing one. And if the service managers aren't really bought into the digital thing, then over time you'll lose some of that momentum that you gained. So it's just a observation. I think the next one here was really about the insight. So we're putting lots of information in right now. We're not quite so good at getting it out. I think the fourth comment here really is around we've created a big backlog. So this is partly an observation of building ourselves. Is we've now got this very large tail of things people want, and it's really difficult to prioritize that and make sure we deliver in time. Great, because we're getting fantastic feedback. It'd be great if it could do this, but then actually having the resource to build those features in can be difficult. And then I've commented on this, connections, devices, basic hygiene factors. If you get those right up front, everything else will be easier. And we're doing a big push at the moment to try and fix some of those issues. It's not all sites, but if we're rolling out things across the whole organization, if there's even 10% of services that are struggling, that can make that rollout impossible, because those 10% say we can't use that functionality, so therefore you can't make it mandatory for everyone to do. So it does hold us back. So be careful on those things. Next slide, please. I'll probably miss everything. I'm just conscious of time. We're in a reflective mode, I guess, at the moment. What's gone well, what hasn't gone so well, what do we need to do next? So all of these questions are in and around that topic of where do we go now, and how fast do we push? Next slide, please. So this is some of the conclusions of that last slide, which is what we realized we need to agree a governance structure. It's a bit of a grand word, but the focus all became about the app. And actually what we realized is there's a whole load of things, which is obvious from the program, that go into digital. Those are digital skills of our colleagues. Those are the hygiene factors, connectivity. There's cyber. There's there's the kit. There's the application. All of those things. And we feel that it's important that part of our organization that does SPS actually really understands sort of the multifaceted nature of digital, rather than just think it's all about the app, because it isn't all about the app. That's part of the whole thing. We are adopting the What Good Looks Like framework, from DHSC and their success criteria, on the basis that why would we do anything different? And it fits with what we're doing anyway. So we're using it as a sort of standard framework, and it helps frame the conversations we have with colleagues. We are widening our focus beyond the app. So we're thinking about that whole digital experience, what that means. One of the things we have been very aware of is putting any other digital into a service. Things I was having a conversation with someone this morning about virtual reality and augmented reality. And what we found is, unless our colleagues are comfortable digitally, it doesn't matter whether they're good at that, unless they're comfortable digitally, actually putting any more technology in just won't work. It'll just sit in a drawer because people don't feel comfortable with it. So we need to build up building up those skills and capabilities in digital is really key. So we're going back and looking at some of the key things, getting feedback on a constant basis and then actioning that feedback. So if people are telling us that they've got connectivity issues, we're going to resolve those. So we're really going back to basics on some of this and seeing what the feedback on the ground is. I think Trish went through the Alice in Wonderland digital skills matrix, looking at, and we want to do that over time, and we need to improve people's maturity on that. And then, some basic stuff, working on getting the data out and on, delivering that functionality that people want out of the application. I guess what's both a challenge is the amount of things in our backlog, but it's also very pleasing because it means people care about it and they really want it to work. And so some things we're also doing, things like trying to resolve agency access, which can be difficult with people coming in and out. Have they got access to the device? Do they know how to use the application, et cetera, et cetera? So yeah, lots of good learnings, and definitely for us maturing our digital journey, and it is a journey. So that's it from us for now. We're very happy to take questions at the end, and at this point hand over to Lee at Ambient. And apologies for running over slightly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark and Trish. I mean, I think that presentation was definitely insightful. I think from an end-to-end journey, build versus buy, digital technologies of your staff, and who's going to be digital championing it across, if it's a small or large organization, that's the fundamental part to it. But a lot of interesting points to take away from that presentation. So thank you, Mark and Trish. What I will do now is hand over to Lee from Ambient. I'll bring up the slides now for you, Lee.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Hope you're well. I promise you I'm not going to talk at you for more than 20 minutes. So hopefully it will be a sort of a quick view of where we are. But the aim of this presentation really is to give you a brief insight into our digital transformation journey, but specifically sort of care planning, care quality compliance, and kind of digital records, and with a focus on kind of the how and why. So a focus on kind of why we embarked on this journey, and a focus on the how we went from coming up with the idea of where we wanted to go to selecting a supplier, right through to kind of a very brief overview and implementation, and hopefully not covering too much of the same ground as our colleagues at MenCap have just covered. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Kate. So a brief overview of Ambient. So we're a medium-sized adult health and social care charity. We have a portfolio of older people services, mental health services, and learning disability services. And we kind of cover a range of how we deliver those services. So from residential right through to independent living. So we've got quite a complex kind of web of services to be able to kind of meet the criteria of delivering a system to. And hopefully what I'll talk about here is scalable. So almost kind of agnostic of the size of your organization, the processes that I'll go through, you can kind of scale dependent on the size of your organization. I've certainly found these beneficial in previous roles I've had, and it certainly seems to have worked here at Ambient as well. So I've kind of mentioned what we're gonna do, but the key takeaways is really important at the end as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Kate. So kind of our journey, really, I think the housekeeping is critically important. I know our colleagues at MenCap kind of touched on this, but the last thing you want to do is get halfway through a project and find out that you're delivering an enterprise-wide system that you need everybody to access, but not everybody's got an email address, which is how they will access the system. So you've got to have the right Microsoft licenses, the right email addresses. By creating more users, you're creating more vulnerability in the system. So you need to ensure that you have the right security protocols in place to protect your assets, to protect your data from hackers, and make sure that you're compliant with GDPR. If you're going to have multiple systems and applications, you want to make sure that your users only have to input their credentials once. So you don't want to have people logging onto 7 or 8 different systems across your organization. That's a deterrent for them using it effectively and adopting it in future. So you want to ensure that you've got the right technology fundamental capability in place to allow people to have that single sign-on and single point of access. So we've procured an internal communication system which has a dashboard with all our applications, where once people are signed into, they're already signed into those applications, so they can just click on whatever application they need from a single source in order to be able to get to what they want. And we found that critical of ease of navigation for users to make sure that that's really important. So before you do anything, like those technology fundamentals are absolutely critical to get right, because if you don't think about them now, they're gonna hit you in the face as you go down whatever line you go down, and that'll delay your project, which costs money and delays return on investment. So really important to get right. Equally as important is gaining buy-in from the senior leadership team, because there'll be difficult hurdles to navigate along the way. And one of those, actually, believe it or not, the easy part is picking what you want to do. So getting the supplier, making the decision about the system, as complex as that is the easy part. The hard part is adoption and the continued improvement and adoption of the system. And without senior leadership buy-in, you're not going to be able to keep pressing the buttons to ensure that people continually use the system in the way they need to use it. And if they don't, you're going to have gaps in your data and information and disparity in the organisation. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Kate. The sort of progressing in our journey. So from that point, we kind of really kind of shook the organisational strategy around a little bit. We needed to make sure it was fit for purpose, that defined a clear vision and gave us real priorities in terms of what we wanted to achieve and when we wanted to achieve it. Once we've done that, we were then able to create a technology strategy that aligned with our organizational strategy, that provided us with a technology vision and allowed us really to kind of grab hold of something that supported us through the journey. So there's no point in embarking on something if you don't know what your destination is going to be. And those two documents were our guiding light to create what we wanted to do, and allowed us to really talk to people, to be able to help them understand where we wanted to get to and how we wanted to get to it. What we then did was kind of within that technology strategy, we set some technology principles. So these are either called architectural principles, technology operating principles, or just technology principles. And again, these are critical. So the first one is user-led. And what I mean by that is just because it's a technology system doesn't mean it's technology system. So it has to be defined and chosen by the users. However, having said that, these technology principles are non-negotiable. They should be set by your technology department, governed and policed by technology. And the reason for that is as you expand your network, you need to build it on a consistent framework. So you could decide you wanted to be a Microsoft house, you wanted to be buy before build. Each system that you procure has to have the right integration plugins in order to be able to share your data to the next system. And it all has to have a standardized security model within it as well. So those principles guide what can be bought and used within the organization, but that's the principles that then the users and the rest of the organization can be supported in going to buy and procure different systems. So next slide, please, Kate. So now we get to kind of the interesting bit where we've called it selecting a supplier, but it's kind of, we've called it that because we've got a buy before build methodology, but if you weren't sure what you wanted to do, it's kind of scoping the market initially. So what we did was we defined the scope of this particular project that we wanted. So we defined it as we wanted care planning tools. We wanted to make sure that we were able to do our audits online, so quality and compliance, and store our digital care records as well. What we decided was out of scope, and interestingly kind of aligns with MenCap, is we decided EMAR was out of scope because that's a really complex environment for us to navigate at the minute. However, what we did was we knew that we wanted that to be enabled in future. So even though it was out of scope, whatever we were going to procure had to have the capability of delivering that in future. So we assured ourselves that we were future-proofing the products that we were going to buy by ensuring that our technology strategy and our organizational strategy were aligned to guide us to make sure that we were asking the right questions of suppliers today, even though we might not want to use that capability for 2 years. So that's really important. Once we've got that scope defined, we explored the market, and that's not just a Google search. We went to trade shows around the UK. There were adult health and social care digital trade shows, as well as NHS and statutory organisation trade shows. We quizzed suppliers at those trade shows. That's really hard work, having the same conversation with 8 or 9 different suppliers. And from that, we created a pool of potential suppliers that could deliver what we wanted to do. Once we'd got that pool of suppliers, we then gathered intelligence from across the organisation in terms of what actually we wanted the system to do. So we knew the scope. Now we wanted to know what we wanted the system to do. And they were in 2 forms. So they were functional requirements and non-functional requirements. And the functional requirements were what we wanted the system to do on a day-to-day operational basis. We wanted to capture data. We wanted to have voice to text. We wanted it to be able to work offline as well as online. We wanted it to be app focused. So they're your functional requirements. Your non-functional are what security requirements do we want that system to have? What database do we want that system to be built on? How does it integrate with our other systems? So you've got kind of a level of different requirements that you want to be able to gather. Once we've done that, we set up an internal project team. That was mainly operations, but it involved communications from the start, people and culture, learning management. So we kind of had a cross-functional team there. And that was the governance around the project that we were delivering. And that was led by our director of operations, not by me or not by technology. We were just part of that project team. And then we kind of set up a user panel. So this was twofold. So the user panel was the people that were delivering the service on a day-to-day basis, and they were going to support us through the demonstration phase to ensure that we were picking the right system that they felt comfortable they could use from day one. But we also set up a service user panel, because there's access for our service users as well as their families, and we wanted to ensure that they were also comfortable with the information they were going to be presented and how they could manage their own care as we went forward as well. So once we'd done that, we designed something called a PQQ, which is a pre-qualifying questionnaire. So all that is putting your requirements into a formal document that you can then send suppliers for suppliers to formally write back to you and tell you and explain to you how they can meet your requirements. And from that, you can score them, you can shortlist. So we shortlisted to 4 potential suppliers. And then we kind of repeated that process, but for demonstrations. So we ran a series of demonstrations, management demos, user-led demos across the organization, which were all scored. So it was subjective, not in terms of we were scoring them, or objective. And then we were able to kind of get that down to 2 potential suppliers, where we then interrogated them on their weaknesses through kind of Q&A, and then we made our final decision about which supplier we were going to use. Kate, could you move to the next slide, please? So in terms of implementation, one of the major perks of buy before build is that you're actually outsourcing your project management, your implementation, your learning material and resource development, because you're picking a supplier that does all of that for you. So what you're saying is, I want you as my supplier, as part of the procurement process, to hold our hand through the process of design, implementation, teaching our staff how to use it, and ensuring that we get it right before we're actually left to our own devices. And that removes the burden of those things internally. Yes, you probably still have to have a project manager, but actually you've got much more scope in order to freedom in order to kind of utilize their expert kind of values. And we used the project team initially and their expertise to kind of do the kind of skeleton minimum viable product configuration of the system. And when we felt we'd got it to a point where we could launch the pilot sites, we strategically picked 4 or 5 pilot sites around the UK in different portfolios. And then we moved to a more agile approach, where we had a constant feedback loop between those pilot sites and the project team, feeding back what was working well, what wasn't working well, constant configuration and reconfiguration of the system until we felt we'd got it to a point that we could nationally roll it out. And then we used the pilot sites expertise, so the team leaders, the managers of the schemes, and the care and support workers, and they were the people that went and taught the next scheme how to adopt the system. So it wasn't done from a project perspective, it wasn't done from a leadership perspective. It was those individuals that went out and supported the rest of the organisation to adopt the system. And if you can move to the next slide, please, sorry. And that brings us on to communication, because everything was user-led, from how we implemented the system to how we communicated how the system was working. So not once did you see me talking about the system, or our CEO Mark Milton talking about the system, or our director of operations. All you saw were care and support workers, team leaders and managers of the schemes talking about the system. And we used it on our internal comms, through email, or whatever it was. Kate, I hope the play button works on that. If it doesn't, that's fine, because we've got a video embedded on that, but it doesn't look like it's going to work.
I can't seem to find the play button on it.
Okay. We just wanted to give you an example of the kind of communications we use to inform the rest of the organisation to feel comfortable with the system that we were implementing. And basically, it just showed interviews with individuals within schemes, saying how they'd adopted it, what their concerns originally were, and then how they overcame them concerns in order to be able to adopt the system. That's fine, Kate. Don't worry if you can't. Hopefully the link will go when we share the slides. The link will be available to people through sharing the slides, so that's not a problem. And then the final slide, I think. I said it wouldn't be more than 20 minutes. So the final slide for us is kind of key takeaways. So I can't reiterate enough. I know our colleagues at MenCap said this, is get your basics right. Don't move to even scoping what you want without really understanding what you need your technology capability to do. That's everything from connectivity within the schemes that you've got, through to the kit that you want to use within the schemes, through to Microsoft licensing, through to accessibility. Get that right, and then it makes everything easier later on. You can't communicate enough, so the more the better. And we do it all the time, and we never get it right. We never do enough, but we do as much as we possibly can, and we use the right channels in order to do that. And some learning I've taken from my kind of previous roles and brought into Ambient is we record all the demos and store all the tender documentation in a logical order. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is if there's any indecisiveness within the project team about selection, you've got a record to go back and review the demos that you've had. If somebody has a view of a particular product and you have a different view, you can both watch the demo together and talk through it. But more importantly, it puts accountability on the supplier. So you'll hear stories of suppliers saying they can do this, and when we've implemented it, can't do that. Well, this cuts that down completely. So if you implement a system and you don't think it can do what the sales team told you it can do, you can review the documentation, review the demos, and gives you a really good way of then talking to your supplier and saying, look, you've said it can do this, guys, and incentivizes them to fix the problem really quickly, I promise you. And that kind of moves on to the key lesson around relationships within the supplier is absolutely critical. So the way I've tended to work that in the past that's worked for me is I leave the day-to-day communication with the supplier with the project team. So the project manager in the project team generally has that. But I tend to create a relationship with probably their senior kind of commercial director within the organization. And that allows an escalation point should things not go so well. And then that's when you can kind of start using those demos that you've recorded and the documentation with it. So that's all from us. It would have been 20 minutes if we had the video though, Kate. So I'm almost there, right? But it allows for more questions. Hopefully that was nice and quick and kind of bite-sized and easy for everyone to understand, but thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Lee. I think one of the key points I'm taking away from that presentation was when you decide to buy rather than build, how fundamental it is to do the scope for those that you're wanting to use as the basis of the software. So if you're going, you know, whoever it is, make sure that you've extensively researched and make sure that people in your organization are key kind of components of that decision-making process when it comes to what the interface will look like or what the process will be. Thank you, Lee. That's really great. What I'm going to quickly do is look on our chat. And we have lots of questions to ask to our panel, so I'm just going to read through some of them. Do you have others accessing the app, e.g. volunteers, agency? How does that work in both of your organisations? I'll bring that question to you, Mark and Trish first.
Trish, I'll have a go first. So it's critical to get right, particularly in a context where we've got lots of agency staff working within the organisation. And I don't know how Ambient and Lee have solved it, but you know, part of our key technical underpinnings is we used a Microsoft identity. So an identity is kind of the thing you log on with, you know, normally your email account. And that's we've got an automated process for people who are permanent members of staff. So that all works. But what we find with agency, it's much harder because you might have very short notice that someone's coming in and they actually don't need access to a whole load of things. You know, if you're paying, for instance, we're Microsoft like Ambient, and if you have to have a full license, then you've a whole load of potential, a whole load of costs associated with it, someone coming in to consume services. So we're looking at a model of extending. Microsoft have a model where you can have a full user, and then they have a model where you can have what's called B2C, but it basically means someone can use their own personal identity, so their Hotmail account or their Gmail account, and you can link that to an account that we have that allows them to authenticate with their account. So we're currently trialing that at the moment, and that would work for both agency and volunteer staff. But as Trish replied in the chat, although technically those things are possible, you know, there's all sorts of information security issues. There are training issues. You know, if someone's coming in just, you know, for, you know, with next to no notice, and normally you'd go through a 3-week onboarding process for a full member of staff, you're expecting that to happen in half an hour at the beginning of a shift. You know, so there's some expectation management as well as just the practicalities, but the practicalities of that and accessing devices. So again, from an information security perspective, you know, people accessing shared devices is really problematic. And so therefore you've got to think about how you're going to allow intermittent users or non-full-time members of staff access. So yeah, so some tricky things, and practically it has to, it's one of those things. Service managers, oh, this person rocked up. It just, I'll put it in quotes. It just needs to work, and it does, because you don't have the time to go through that whole, onboarding. Here's how you do things. It's like, okay, you started, off you go. Here's a device, and it should be really easy to work. That's certainly some of the feedback we've had from our service managers. If it isn't easy, it just won't get done. And then we have a different set of problems to contend with.
I'd just add just to add a bit to Mark's point about, sometimes these things can be very short notice, and even where you try and find a workaround for that, and perhaps if you're working with an agency who's providing people, and you think about embedding some training with that agency so that they can kind of pre-train people, you can still do all of that and then find that a different person turns up on the day to do the actual shift. So there aren't any super simple ways around that, other than to try and embed the training within your actual system that you're using, which then puts a challenge back on design in terms of keeping that really, really simple and intuitive. So yeah, it's a challenge. We haven't cracked it yet.
Did you want me, Kate, to come in?
Yeah, go on.
So we have role-based access. So like everybody who joins our organisation permanently or temporarily will have an Active Directory account, and that Active Directory account is synced to access only certain parts of our ecosystem. So they can have central access, but they can't get any further than that. But again, because we've got multi-factor authentication, it's kind of linked to them and protected. In terms of the care planning side of things, so we have mobile sort of, not iPads, but we have kind of tablets within each scheme. Each tablet is registered to that scheme, so can't be used outside of that scheme at all. And then each user has their own logon within that device, and that device is locked down to the IP address of that scheme as well. So if somebody takes it outside the front door, it no longer accesses, even if they can log in. So it has to be done in that way. And what we've created is we've created several agency profiles within each of our schemes. So if we do have temporary staff come in, they log on to agency one, and because we can kind of create a password last minute for them. So if we know an agency staff's coming on Saturday, the manager can create a temporary password for that agency one staff. They can then access the system, but they can only access it through a device that's locked down to that scheme and is registered only at that scheme. And they will only see the information and data for our residents, for the ones that are actually registered to care for. So they won't even see all of the data of our service users in that scheme. They will only see them for the ones that they're tasked to support. So we've locked down the data in that way as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Lee. I think there's another question aimed towards Ambient. How long did the selection of supplier process take? And they would also like to know reference to the system that you selected in the end.
Yeah, so in terms of the selection process, it's very much kind of internally governed by yourselves. I think we might have taken a bit longer because it was just harder to get people in the right place at the right time in terms of demonstrations. I mean, if you're thinking you've got 4 suppliers, you're looking at a 2-hour demo minimum for one cohort, and then maybe a 2-hour demo for each other cohort. So you're looking at individuals' times of around 12 to 14 hours just to watch the demonstrations. That's not then including the scoring and the scoring of the PQQ, and then the conversations around the selection at the end of it. So you could, once you've identified the suppliers and you've got the demo set up, as brave as, as long as you've got all the information to hand, you can make that decision quite quickly. Suppliers, it also gives you a good judgment on how flexible suppliers are. So if you want to do it fairly quickly and suppliers aren't amenable to you wanting to do it fairly quickly, how amenable are they going to be during the implementation process? So I also gain a lot from the behavior of the suppliers through that selection process in terms of, do they really want your business? How much are they willing to bend over in order to get you to kind of the point where you can make that decision? So I think there's, how long's a piece of string? You can do it really quickly. It took us from identifying 8 potential vendors through to signing the contract 4 months, if that helps. And look, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to give you the supplier name that we use, but honestly, all 8 of the suppliers that we honed down could have done the job, and we had some specific needs in terms of flexibility, and we chose Ambient. Sorry, Ambient, that's us. We chose the Access Group to supply ours. And again, look, you'll hear good, bad, and ugly about all suppliers. It's how you manage the supplier. That's a really important point in all of that.
Fantastic, thanks, Lee. I've got a quick one more question for Ambient to do with buyer supplier. We find that more and more suppliers are not offering training / guide support. Did your supplier offer this, or did you have to negotiate hard to get it?
No, we kicked suppliers out that didn't offer that. That was a non-negotiable.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was a short and sweet answer, but yeah, I think from our perspective as well, we found that it was a non-negotiable. So most agencies did actually mean to that, so that was great. I've got another one here. So have you managed to leverage the NFP licensing model from Microsoft? If so, what impact has that had on your organizations? And is there anything others should watch out for / consider? I'll bring it up with Mark and Trish.
Yes, so Microsoft offers standard discounting on their licensing model for the not-for-profit sector. It is standardized now, so you can't really negotiate with them, but they do have different models, and we're in them. It gets quite not technical very soon, but it gets very sort of administrative and mundane in a conversation quite soon. But Microsoft have 2 models, one of which is an enterprise license, and one of which they've now got a new license model called an F, which is for frontline staff, which actually for most, it's designed for predominantly sectors like health and social care, where you've got a lot of frontline staff that don't really need access. They don't really need a full set of access. They need a cut down version of access. So it's Microsoft licensing is a bit of a minefield, both commercially and also understanding what you get for your money. Word of caution, it's not hugely straightforward, but there are substantial discounts to be had, and we actually, most of our frontline support workers essentially use a free Microsoft license. So for many people you don't need a full paid for license, but you do need to think about it, and it's worth going through a third party Microsoft licensing organization who can help you navigate that. It's quite difficult to do it yourself and get the right mix would be my observation on that. I don't know, Lee, whether your experience is different. But
no, it's exactly the same. Nothing really to add. My advice is to go for a third party supplier. It's a minefield to understand. I don't understand it. That's why I go through a third party. They'll know you're a charity, and they will be able to leverage NFP for you on your behalf.
Wonderful. And I have one last final question, which I find quite an interesting one, actually. I note that you both added medicine recording at a later stage. What were the reasons for this? And were there any learnings from taking this approach? I'll start off, Lee.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we had a plethora of kind of pharmacy suppliers within locations, let alone across the UK, and they were all at different kind of abilities in terms of integration with systems and kind of, it was just really, really complex, and we didn't feel, because of where we were geographically, that we could implement an enterprise-wide solution at this point in time. It didn't mean that we didn't want the capability to do it in future, but right now it just felt it was, with implementing a care planning software system and care compliance and auditing software, we just felt it was probably one step too far and just really complicated at the minute. So we chose not to tackle that problem right now, as it seemed to be operating okay as it was. But if it starts tidying up in the future, we'll definitely tackle it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was always one of the kind of high risk areas that that were in the plan, and it took a while for that sort of feature to be built in our kind of homegrown app. The original plan, funnily enough, was to roll it out to all services who were supporting people with medicines, which is quite a lot of our services. But we rolled back on that actually for various reasons, partly connectivity, because if you can't connect, and I don't think we've got any services that can't connect full stop. They've all got a means, but not always reliably. So if you need to check somebody's medicines on a shift handover, you've got to check it. You know, you can't kind of put that off or say I'll do that in an hour when the internet connection comes back up or whatever. And also there's the colleagues' confidence with their own kind of digital skills, and we're still with some colleagues supporting and helping people to feel more confident. So when you introduce something slightly more high risk like medicines, you need everybody who's in that service to feel fully confident about what they're doing with the digital tools. So so we've scaled back and said, you know, that those services that feel confident and ready and have a good and reliable connection, they can go ahead and start to use the medicines features, but it's not mandatory for everybody, which means that some services are still working on the old system, which is much more paper-based, and we will get there eventually, but we've got work to do to make sure that we minimize the risk, obviously, to the people we support. Mark, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
I don't think I've got much to add, other than there's one thing that Lee mentioned in passing in their requirements, which I think has come back slightly to bite us. And Lee mentioned one of their non-functional requirements was that systems should work both online and offline. And actually what we've ended up building is a solution that relies on permanent internet connectivity. So in our context, connectivity becomes even more important, because if you don't have it, you can't work. So, you know, critical things like, you know, incident reporting and meds, which can't wait, then you really, you know, it makes connectivity really critical. So it's a useful, you know, check to say, but when Lee mentioned that, you know, about the importance of offline access, that can be really critical, and it can make quite a big difference in terms of subsequently what you can and can't do as a result of that. And for us, you can do that, but it increases our cost significantly, because we have to, you know, we would have to re-architect the application that we've built. And that's where I talk about the total cost of ownership, where, you know, you don't really realize something at the outset, and then as you go through and you think, oh, it's really critical, we can do this, suddenly you've got to build it yourself, and that introduces cost to you as an organization, whereas a third party will deliver that as standard if you put it in your requirements document and say, you know, you as a supplier need to be able to provide this to me, then you know you're getting it. Whereas when you're building it, you've got to build it from scratch, and that often takes a lot longer than you think and costs a lot more than you had anticipated.
Wonderful. I am aware that we've only got a couple of minutes left of the session, but there are 2 points that I think maybe need to be discussed. One of them was mentioned earlier in the chat about data protection, GDPR. How did, when having the digital adoption journeys, how did both organisations go about making sure that they were compliant at all times? So that's probably one focus. And then the other one is on what tools did you use to support colleagues in improving digital skills? So it's I'll pose both those questions briefly for about a minute or two before we finish.
Yeah, good questions. I think GDPR is probably a bit easier for us to answer, in terms of we just ensured the supplier met the burden of GDPR. So our systems internally do, and our access points governed by that role-based access do meet GDPR standards, and the integration and the security and the role-based access within the systems that we procured also meet the high standard of GDPR as well, and how they're stored. In terms of kind of digital skills, if I'm honest, we haven't done a major piece of work around that we've kind of specifically taught people how to use the application to support the care management. because the people on the ground are the ones that literally just fire up the tablet and it's there in front of them. Their tasks are there. So it's more demonstrating how to use that application. It's the scheme managers and deputy managers that have to access a desktop site in order to be able to look at the analytics and program that. And they're the individuals that we've spent a little bit more time with in terms of how to support them to utilize that bit of software. But specific digital skills, we've not really done an awful lot of that. We've not felt we've needed to at the minute, but it might be something we come into a brick wall at a later stage.
Wonderful. Any last comments from MenCap before we finish?
I think in contrast, we had to do quite a lot with digital skills, and I think some of that was about helping colleagues to see that actually they got digital skills that weren't immediately front of mind. So we had a number of colleagues saying, I don't use digital tools, it's not the job I do, it's not the job I've done for 30, 40 years, you know, this isn't what I come into work for, and I've no experience. But actually, when you talk to people and find out that they are using things like Facebook or the social media platforms, they are using eBay, they're doing all sorts of things digitally actually that don't first come to people's minds in a work context. So some of it was about helping colleagues to make the connections, because then they felt more confident. You know, this wasn't something completely different, it's digitally based, it works in a similar way broadly to other digital platforms. So actually trying to kind of challenge perhaps assumptions that people didn't use digital tools at work and therefore couldn't do that. But then we did provide quite a lot of learning products, I'll call it, because some of it was online, some of it was face-to-face initially, but then we had to move that on to Teams. But we still provided a person to come online and ask questions of. We did online demos. We asked managers to coach and support colleagues. We had digital champions supporting people locally who were more confident with their digital skills and could help their colleagues. And we had really great feedback around the digital champion model. We had about 70% of managers came back and said the digital champion had been fundamental. So we provided quite a bit, I think, in that area.
Wonderful. I am aware that is our time. We could probably talk about this for the next hour or so on the learning journeys of digital adoption. I know I could, but that's just me being a bit nerdy. So I want to say a huge thank you to Trish Markley for giving the presentation today. We will be making the recording available from today, and also the slides I will be sending out to everyone who was on the link for today's webinar. But yeah, thank you again everyone for joining us so much, and thank you for the speakers. It was wonderful. I've taken away so much from today, and I hope that everyone else has too. So on that note, thank you everyone, and please take care, and look forward for the next Digital Communication of Practice Journey webinar. Take care everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.